In the spring of 2024, a home in Pontiac, Michigan, became the scene of a nightmare no one could have imagined. 18-year-old Megan Amirowicz lived with her father, 64-year-old Conrad. To neighbors, they looked like a struggling family. Nothing outwardly suggested that their lives were spiraling toward tragedy. But behind the walls, the relationship between father and daughter was frayed, marked by constant shouting matches, slammed doors, and a deepening reservoir of anger. Conrad was described as strict, a man who believed in discipline and tough lessons. Megan, by contrast, was rebellious, restless, and increasingly volatile. Friends noticed her mood swings. Teachers saw her attitude change. She often spoke about how she hated being controlled. For her, Conrad represented not a father, but a jailer, the one figure standing between her and the independence she craved. In homes like theirs, tension often burns silently until it fades, but in this case, it was about to ignite. On a quiet evening in March, Conrad went to bed as usual, unaware that his daughter had reached a breaking point. There was no screaming argument that night, no loud threats that sent neighbors running for their phones. The moment that followed was quiet, almost eerily quiet. Megan, fueled by anger and a twisted sense of defiance, reached for something most people would never imagine as a weapon, a bottle of lye drain cleaner. She walked into the room where her father slept, tilted the bottle, and poured the caustic liquid over him. It burned instantly. His skin blistered, his lungs filled with poison. Conrad jolted awake in indescribable agony, his body on fire from the inside out. He would survive this attack, but survival was not mercy. He spent months in hospitals enduring repeated surgeries, skin grafts, and the kind of pain that doctors struggle to measure. For Conrad, every breath was a reminder of what his own daughter had done. When questioned by investigators, Megan's story wavered. At times, she insisted it was a mistake. At others, she described it as a moment of impulse, but detectives quickly saw through her words. The evidence was undeniable. The chemical burns, the purchase of the drain cleaner, and Conrad's own testimony before his death. A psychologist later analyzed Megan's choices. They didn't describe her as insane. They described her as immature, reckless, and consumed by rage. Choosing chemicals over a weapon was seen as both impulsive and cruel, a deliberate act to cause suffering rather than a split-second decision. This wasn't the chaos of a heated argument. It was a choice carried out in cold defiance. In court, prosecutors painted a stark picture. They laid out how Conrad had lived his last months in unbearable pain, fighting for life, while Megan showed little remorse. The jury listened to her shifting accounts, the medical testimony, and the investigative details. Their conclusion was clear. Megan Amirowicz was guilty of manslaughter and related charges. She was sentenced to prison, her teenage years traded for the weight of a crime that can never be undone. For Conrad's loved ones, the sentence offered no solace. They lost not just a father and relative, but also a daughter to the prison system, a family tree cut down from both sides in a single act. This case forces us to confront the darkest corners of family life. A father is supposed to be a shield. A daughter is supposed to be his legacy. But in Pontiac, Michigan, those roles reversed in a way that defies comprehension. Megan Amirowicz's story is more than a courtroom headline. It is a warning about what happens when anger is left to fester unchecked, when resentment grows stronger than empathy, and when the ties of blood are poisoned beyond repair. Conrad Amirowicz's death wasn't just the end of one man's life. It was the destruction of a bond that should have been sacred. A father and daughter torn apart, not by circumstance, but by choice. Megan's choice. And that choice left scars that no prison sentence can erase. Families like theirs remind us that anger, left to fester, can corrode the very roots of love until nothing remains but ashes. But Megan's case, as disturbing as it is, was not an isolated tragedy. Across America, other daughters have crossed the same forbidden line, some killed in silence, others in storms of rage, and some carried their secrets far longer, hiding their crimes in ways that almost defied belief. In our next story, we go to the mountains of North Carolina, where a teenage girl didn't just kill her father, she tried to erase him from existence, burying the truth in a shed while she turned their home into a playground. This is the chilling case of Crystal Brooke Howell. In the quiet town of Maggie Valley, North Carolina, February of 2014 began like any other winter month in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But behind the doors of one modest home, something unspeakable was about to unfold. 17-year-old Crystal Brooke Howell lived with her father, Michael Joseph Howell, a 50-year-old man trying to raise his daughter through the turbulence of adolescence. To neighbors, they looked like a normal family. Michael was strict but caring, a man who worked to provide structure in a daughter's life that seemed to be spinning off balance. Crystal, by contrast, was restless. She craved freedom, resented rules, and grew more defiant as the months passed. Teachers described her as troubled. Friends whispered about her darker moods, the way she sometimes seemed detached from reality. Beneath the surface, their relationship was one of constant tension, a father's discipline clashing with a daughter's rebellion. On the morning of February 24th, 2014, that fragile relationship snapped. As her father sat in the family home, Crystal retrieved a shotgun and pulled the trigger. The blast killed him instantly. In that single moment, she turned from daughter to killer. But what came next was perhaps even more disturbing. Instead of calling for help or confessing, Crystal dragged her father's body into the backyard shed. There, she stuffed his remains into a plastic container, hiding him away as though she could erase what she had done. And then, astonishingly, she returned to the house and carried on with her life as if nothing had happened. In the days and weeks that followed, Crystal didn't withdraw in guilt. Instead, she embraced indulgence. She invited friends over for wild parties. She spent her father's money recklessly. At one point, she even had a stripper pole installed in the kitchen. The very house where her father had once tried to guide her became the stage for her reckless defiance, while his body lay forgotten in the shed just yards away. For months, the secret was held. Friends partied, music blared, the world went on, until the smell of decay began to raise questions and suspicions reached the authorities. When deputies arrived at the property, they made the grisly discovery. Michael Howell's decomposed body was sealed in a plastic container, hidden by the daughter he had once tried to protect. Investigators confronted Crystal, and the facade quickly crumbled. Faced with evidence she could not deny, she admitted to the killing. Prosecutors painted her as cold, calculating, and disturbingly remorseless. This wasn't just an impulsive crime, they argued. It was an act of anger, followed by months of deception and selfish indulgence. Psychologists later described her as deeply troubled, a teenager battling depression, self-destructive impulses, and a fascination with testing boundaries that should never have been crossed. But mental illness alone could not explain away what she had done. The facts were too stark. She had killed her father, hidden his body, and carried on as if he had never existed. In 2016, Crystal Brooke Howell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. A judge sentenced her to a minimum of 25 years in prison, ensuring she would spend her entire young adulthood behind bars. For Michael's family and friends, the sentence brought a kind of closure, but not peace. His life had been stolen not by a stranger, not by an enemy, but by the very person he had raised and loved. The story of Crystal Howell is not just about a murder. It's about the collapse of a bond that should have been unbreakable. A father trying to discipline and protect a daughter consumed by anger and rebellion, and a choice that turned a home into a crime scene. For the community, it left a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats don't come from outside the home, they come from within it. Michael Howell's death was not just a family tragedy, it was a portrait of deception and denial. His body lay hidden in a shed, while his daughter lived recklessly, as though she could dance over the silence of the grave. What makes Crystal's story unforgettable is not only the killing itself, but the way she tried to erase her father's existence and rewrite the home they shared into a playground of indulgence. Yet betrayal does not always come from youthful rebellion. Sometimes it comes from those who are older, who plan together, who believe they are clever enough to outsmart justice. In our next case, two grown daughters convinced themselves they had engineered the perfect murder. Their victim was not a stranger, it was their own father. And for years, their secret nearly stayed buried. This is the chilling case of Linda Roberts and Mary Beth Tomaselli. In Clearwater, Florida, the sunlit neighborhoods seemed far removed from murder and conspiracy. But behind the walls of one suburban home, two sisters, Linda Roberts and Mary Beth Tomaselli, were preparing to end the life of the man who had given them theirs. Their father, Anthony Tomaselli, was 85 years old. To neighbors, he was a frail but cheerful man, a father who had lived a long life surrounded by family. What no one knew was that his daughters had already decided his time was up. The story began years earlier. Anthony was elderly, and his health was fading. The sisters claimed they were worried about his suffering, that they wanted to end his pain. But prosecutors would later say something very different. This was not mercy, but calculation, a murder born out of greed and convenience. On a quiet evening in March of 2015, inside the Tomaselli home, the two sisters carried out their plan. They first gave their father alcohol mixed with sleeping pills. When that didn't work fast enough, they smothered him with a pillow until he stopped breathing. Anthony's death certificate would list natural causes. His neighbors and even his other relatives would grieve quietly, never suspecting that the two daughters living under his roof had murdered him in cold blood. But what makes this case even more chilling is what happened after. For years, Linda and Mary Beth carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened. They convinced themselves they had gotten away with it. They even began calling it the perfect murder. It wasn't until 2019, 4 years later, that their secret began to unravel. Investigators received a tip and then a recording. On it, the sisters could be heard casually describing how they had killed their father. They laughed as they explained how they held the pillow over his face, as though they were recounting an errand instead of a killing. Detectives listened in disbelief. Here was not the sound of remorse, but of pride. When police finally confronted them, both sisters admitted their role. Prosecutors wasted no time charging them with murder. The courtroom testimony was a stark reminder of how far family bonds can twist. These were not teenagers acting out of immaturity, nor strangers committing random violence. These were grown women, middle-aged, who planned their father's death, carried it out, and lived with the lie for years. Psychologists examining the case described the sisters' mindset as disturbingly detached. They rationalized the killing as if it were a household chore, cloaking their true motives in a story about mercy. But the evidence, and their own words, pointed to something colder: resentment, frustration, and a willingness to eliminate their father when he became an inconvenience. In court, the sisters faced justice. Both were convicted, their years of secrecy collapsing under the weight of their own confessions. For Anthony's surviving relatives, the pain was indescribable. They had not only lost a father, they had to live with the knowledge that the people responsible were his own children. The Tomaselli case shatters the comforting illusion that family is always safe. Here, two daughters turn their home into a crime scene and a father's final moments into a cruel experiment in control. They believed they had staged the perfect murder, but in the end, their own voices betrayed them. Anthony Tomaselli's death was hidden under the mask of natural causes, a life ended by the very daughters he had raised. For years, Linda Roberts and Mary Beth Tomaselli convinced themselves they had carried out the perfect murder. But no murder is perfect, and in the end, their own words betrayed them. What makes this story unforgettable is not just the crime itself, but the casual cruelty with which they remembered it, as if their father's final breath was nothing more than an afterthought. Yet, if the Tomaselli sisters showed us what happens when family bonds erode into cold calculation, the next case reveals something even darker, a collision of desperation and rage that wiped out not one generation, but two. In Florida, a young mother named Cheyenne Jessie didn't just kill her father. She killed her own 6-year-old daughter as well, leaving behind a story of betrayal so profound it stunned even seasoned investigators. This is the case of Cheyenne Jessie. In the summer of 2015, in Lakeland, Florida, investigators encountered a crime so disturbing it would shake even the most experienced detectives. At the center of the case was 25-year-old Cheyenne Jessie, a young mother caught in a spiral of desperation, denial, and betrayal. Her victims were not strangers, not rivals, but the two people who should have been closest to her father, James Jessie, and her 6-year-old daughter, Meredith. On the surface, Cheyenne was struggling but ordinary. Friends described her as overwhelmed, weighed down by financial trouble and the pressures of single motherhood. She was facing the possibility of losing her daughter in a custody dispute, and she worried about her ability to hold on to stability in her life. To outsiders, these were common stresses, the kind many families face. But inside Cheyenne's mind, they became unbearable burdens. On July 18, 2015, those pressures erupted into violence. Prosecutors later said Cheyenne snapped during an argument with her father inside his home. She grabbed a knife and stabbed him repeatedly, ending his life in a storm of rage. But the violence didn't stop there. In the same home, her 6-year-old daughter, Meredith, became a witness to what her mother had done, and instead of protecting her child, Cheyenne made an unthinkable choice. She killed her too, strangling the little girl whose life she was meant to safeguard. The brutality didn't end with the killings. Cheyenne then hid both bodies in storage containers, concealing them behind a neighbor's home as if she could bury away her crimes. Days later, when Meredith and her grandfather were reported missing, suspicion began to close in. Detectives pieced together timelines, reviewed surveillance, and questioned Cheyenne directly. Her story shifted, her explanations fell apart, and eventually the evidence led to a horrifying discovery. Both victims were dead, concealed in plastic containers less than 100 feet from where she lived. The courtroom proceedings revealed a portrait of a woman unraveling under pressure. Prosecutors argued that Cheyenne's motive was both practical and selfish. She feared losing her daughter, resented her father's involvement, and wanted to eliminate the problems standing in her way. Psychologists described her as emotionally unstable, consumed by anger and impulsivity. But even with these explanations, the question remained: how could a mother strangle her own child? How could a daughter turn a knife on her own father? In 2019, after years of legal delays, a jury found Cheyenne Jessie guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. In the courtroom, members of her family wept. They weren't just grieving the victims. They were grieving Cheyenne, too, a daughter, a sister, a cousin who had destroyed herself, along with the 2 people who trusted her most. The case of Cheyenne Jessie is a stark reminder that family can be both sanctuary and battlefield. What makes her story so haunting is the double betrayal: a father who had cared for her, a daughter who relied on her, both silenced by the same hand. It was a crime that crossed not just one line, but 2, leaving a wound in the community that will never fully heal. The murders committed by Cheyenne Jessie left investigators with a question that had no satisfying answer. How does a daughter take her father's life and then extinguish the future of her own child? Her case was not just a crime. It was the collapse of 2 generations in a single night, a betrayal so deep that no sentence could mend the loss. The silence left behind was deafening. A father gone, a little girl gone, and a mother imprisoned for life, all from one act of violence. But if Cheyenne's story shows us the sudden storm of rage and desperation, our next case reveals something far more calculated. In Colorado, a woman didn't lash out in the heat of the moment. She planned, poisoned, and then entombed her father's body beneath his own home, as though concrete could hold back the truth forever. This is the disturbing case of Dana Jennings. In the winter of 2017, the Denver suburb of Federal Heights, Colorado, was draped in quiet snow. Families strung holiday lights across rooftops. Neighbors gathered for seasonal events, and the hum of life carried on as usual. But for one family, silence was about to become unbearable. 69-year-old William Muthart, a father, grandfather, and well-known figure in his community, suddenly stopped answering his phone. He stopped visiting friends. He stopped showing up altogether. At first, those who knew William thought it might be a seasonal illness or just the fatigue of age, but days turned into weeks. Mail piled up, calls went unanswered, and people began to wonder, where had William gone? Living inside his home during this time was his daughter, Dana Jennings. She reassured anyone who asked that her father was fine, that he was simply keeping to himself. But neighbors noticed things that didn't add up. William had always been dependable. He wouldn't simply vanish without word, and as suspicion grew, police decided to check the home themselves. What they uncovered was not just a disappearance, it was a carefully concealed crime. When officers entered the property, they noticed a strong chemical odor seeping from the crawl space beneath the house. It was unusual, pungent, and deeply unsettling. Investigators tore into the sealed floor and discovered a mound of freshly poured concrete. Beneath it, entombed like a hidden secret, lay the body of William Muthart. The discovery shocked even seasoned detectives. It wasn't just the fact that William had been murdered. It was the methodical way his body had been hidden, cemented beneath the foundation of his own home. The autopsy revealed he had been poisoned. Traces of narcotics were found in his system, and evidence suggested he had been smothered to death. The act was deliberate, cold, and carefully executed. Attention turned immediately to his daughter. Dana had been living in the home at the time. She had access, she had motive, and soon investigators pieced together the story. William, frustrated with Dana's lifestyle and mounting financial problems, had been preparing to evict her. He wanted her out of the home he had worked hard to build. But instead of facing the reality of losing her security, Dana made a choice that stunned her family and horrified her community. She silenced him permanently. The prosecution later described Dana's crime as one of entitlement and control. This was not an impulsive outburst or a moment of panic. It was a slow, calculated act. She poisoned her father, smothered him, and then attempted to erase him from existence by burying him under a blanket of concrete. To her, the solution to losing her home was not negotiation or acceptance. It was annihilation. Neighbors were left reeling. They spoke of William as a man of routine, kind, and deeply family-oriented. They could not reconcile that his final moments came at the hands of his own daughter, and that she lived above his hidden grave for days, perhaps weeks, as though nothing had happened. The courtroom painted an equally haunting picture. Prosecutors revealed the details of the concealment, the supplies Dana had purchased, the lengths she went to in order to disguise the crime. They argued she had shown no remorse, only calculation. The defense tried to frame her as emotionally unstable, citing mental health struggles and poor judgment, but the sheer planning involved in mixing poison, carrying out smothering, and then encasing a body in concrete was impossible to ignore. Jurors didn't take long to decide. In 2019, Dana Jennings was convicted of first-degree murder. Her sentence was absolute, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For William's surviving family, the verdict brought justice, but no peace. They had lost a father, a brother, a friend, and in losing him, they also lost Dana. One act had severed their family from both directions. The victim and the perpetrator, bound by blood, torn apart by betrayal. What makes this case unforgettable is its chilling, methodical nature. Many killings are crimes of passion, acts committed in the heat of anger. But Dana's crime was deliberate, staged, and executed with patience. To not only kill a father, but to entomb him beneath his own home, as though concrete could muffle the truth, is a violation that goes beyond murder. It is erasure. It is the attempt to bury both body and memory, as if love, trust, and fatherhood could be sealed away under stone. In the end, the concrete cracked. The truth emerged, and what remained was the image of a daughter who turned her father's home into his grave, and a family forced to live with the horror of knowing the betrayal came from within. The story of Dana Jennings is haunting not only because of the murder itself, but because of the way she tried to erase it. Poison, smothering, and then entombing her father in concrete, as if cement could seal away both the crime and the memory of who he was. It was not rage in the moment, but calculation stretched over days, and in that calculation, the bond between father and daughter was obliterated. But if Dana's crime was marked by patience and concealment, our next case explodes with chaos and brutality. In Las Vegas, a teenage daughter and her boyfriend didn't hide their violence under layers of concrete. They unleashed it in a frenzy of more than 70 stab wounds, followed by fire. Their crime shocked not just a family, but the entire nation for the sheer savagery of what they did and the youth of those who carried it out. This is the chilling case of Sierra Halseth. Las Vegas is a city that never sleeps, a place where neon lights glow and chaos feels almost normal. But in April of 2021, a crime unfolded in a quiet suburban neighborhood that horrified even this city of extremes. The victim was 45-year-old Daniel Halseth, a father, husband, and friend known for his kindness and dedication to family. The perpetrators were not strangers or masked intruders. They were his own daughter, 16-year-old Sierra Halseth, and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero. What happened inside Daniel's home was more than a killing. It was a slaughter. Prosecutors would later call it one of the most shocking domestic murders Nevada had seen in years. Daniel's relationship with Sierra had grown tense. Like many teenage daughters and fathers, they clashed over boundaries, discipline, and choices. But Sierra had started dating Aaron, and the relationship was more than ordinary teenage rebellion. Her parents disapproved of the romance, and they were right to worry. Behind closed doors, Sierra and Aaron were obsessed with each other. They spoke about running away, defying everyone who stood in their path, and even living out twisted fantasies that blurred the line between love and violence. On the night of April 9th, those fantasies became reality. Armed with knives, Sierra and Aaron launched a brutal attack on Daniel. He was stabbed more than 70 times. The violence was frenzied, calculated, and relentless. Daniel fought to survive, but the injuries were catastrophic. When the attack was over, Sierra and Aaron weren't finished. They dragged his body into the garage, doused it with gasoline, and set it on fire. The crime scene was catastrophic. First responders described blood covering the walls and floors, the smell of smoke and gasoline choking the air. The violence was so extreme that investigators at first struggled to comprehend how two teenagers could carry it out. But the truth would become even darker. Shortly after the murder, Sierra and Aaron fled. They stole Daniel's car, drained his bank accounts, and tried to run away together. Along the way, they filmed themselves laughing, joking, and speaking casually about the killing. In one video, Aaron looked into the camera and said, "Welcome to our YouTube channel, day 3 after the murder." They smiled as if it were a game, a dark parody of teenage adventure, all while Daniel's body still smoldered in his garage. Investigators quickly tracked them down in Salt Lake City, Utah. Their arrest ended the flight, but the evidence was overwhelming. The videos, the bank withdrawals, the crime scene, it all painted a picture of not only violence, but complete disregard for human life. In court, prosecutors emphasized the brutality, 70 stab wounds, the arson, the callousness afterward. They described the pair as thrill seekers who believed their love gave them license to destroy. Sierra's defense pointed to her age, her vulnerability to influence, and a history of conflict at home. But the evidence was clear. Both she and Aaron participated fully in the killing. In 2022, Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero both pleaded guilty to murder, arson, and related charges. Each was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. For Daniel's surviving family, the sentences offered justice, but no closure. They had lost a father, a son, a brother, not to strangers, but to the daughter he had raised. The Halseth case stands out for its sheer brutality and its chilling aftermath. To see two teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, commit such violence and then laugh about it, left a scar not just on a family, but on a community that struggled to make sense of it. It was not only a murder, but a grotesque performance of indifference, captured on video for the world to see. Daniel Halseth's legacy is remembered by those who loved him, but the crime remains a warning of what happens when obsession, defiance, and rage spiral beyond control, and when the ones we expect to protect us become the very source of our destruction. The murder of Daniel Halseth was not just brutal, it was chilling for its indifference. To see a father's life end in a frenzy of 70 stab wounds, only to have his daughter and her boyfriend laugh about it on camera, stripped away the last illusion of innocence. It showed how obsession can warp young love into something monstrous, leaving behind only ashes and grief. Daniel's family lost him to the very person meant to carry his name forward, and the community was left with the haunting truth. Cruelty can wear the face of a child. But while Sierra's crime was born out of reckless youth and obsession, the next story reveals something colder. In Pennsylvania, a daughter in her 50s didn't kill in a storm of teenage rage. She killed with calculation, resentment, and greed. When she was cut out of her father's will, she decided to cut him and his partner out of life itself. This is the case of Sherry Lee Heffernan. In the fall of 2021, the quiet waterside town of Surf City, New Jersey, was rocked by a crime that revealed just how far resentment and greed can twist family ties. The victim was John Jack Enders, an 87-year-old retired businessman, described by neighbors as kind, resilient, and enjoying the later years of his life with his longtime partner, Frances Seagraves. Their seaside home was a place of peace until it became the scene of a double homicide that investigators would never forget. The killer was not a stranger, not a burglar or an intruder. It was Jack's own daughter, Sherry Lee Heffernan, a woman in her 50s who had once been welcomed into her father's home with trust and love. But beneath that trust simmered years of bitterness. Sherry believed she deserved more of her father's estate, more control, more recognition. And when she learned that Jack intended to cut her out of his will, that resentment hardened into a deadly resolve. On September 29, 2021, police discovered the bodies of Jack and Frances inside their Surf City residence. Both had been brutally stabbed multiple times. The crime scene bore the marks of rage, but also determination. This wasn't random violence. It was deeply personal. Detectives soon zeroed in on Sherry. Surveillance footage placed her near the home. Forensic evidence tied her to the scene, and witnesses confirmed the long-simmering disputes over inheritance. The motive became clear: greed fueled by anger at being excluded. She didn't just want money, she wanted to punish her father for what she saw as betrayal. In the courtroom, prosecutors presented a chilling narrative. Here was a daughter who turned resentment into bloodshed, a woman who saw her father's legacy not as something to honor, but as something to seize. They emphasized how she killed not only her father, but also his partner, a woman guilty of nothing but loving him. The double homicide amplified the cruelty. One life ended by greed, another extinguished simply for being in the way. Sherry's defense tried to challenge the evidence, but the weight of the forensic trail was overwhelming. In 2024, she was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. For Jack's surviving family, the sentence delivered accountability, but no comfort. They had lost a father and grandfather. Francise's loved ones had lost a partner and friend. And in the same stroke, they had also lost Sherry, a daughter and sibling whose choices forever poisoned the family tree. Psychologists observing the case pointed to entitlement and bitterness as driving forces. Unlike crimes of passion, this killing was not spontaneous. It was cold, deliberate, and rooted in a sense of ownership, in a belief that family wealth was owed and that any obstacle to it could be cut away with a knife. The Heffernan case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous motives are not explosive anger or uncontrollable impulses, but the slow corrosion of greed. When love turns transactional, when inheritance becomes more important than blood, family can transform from sanctuary into battleground. And in Surf City, that battleground left 2 people dead and a daughter behind bars for the rest of her life. The murders of Jack Enders and Francis Seagraves proved that greed can be just as lethal as rage. Sherry Lee Heffernan wasn't a teenager overcome by impulse. She was a grown woman who allowed entitlement to fester until it became a weapon. She didn't just kill her father. She erased his future plans, his love, and even his partner, all because she couldn't stand being cut out of a will. In the end, she traded freedom for life behind prison walls and her family for the cold company of regret. But while Sherry's crime revealed the corrosive power of greed, our final case brings us to the present. And it delivers a reminder that the cycle of betrayal between fathers and daughters has not ended. In Florida, a woman named Christiana Ann Adams unleashed a deadly storm of violence that left her father dead, another man gravely injured, and a courtroom stunned. Her story closes this series not only because of its brutality, but because it is the most recent, a fresh wound that reminds us these tragedies are not relics of the past. They are happening even now. This is the case of Christiana Ann Adams. In early 2025, the state of Florida witnessed a crime that would remind the nation just how fragile family ties can become when resentment and rage spiral out of control. At the center of the case was Christiana Ann Adams, a daughter whose violence would leave her family shattered and her community reeling. Her father, William Bill Adams, was 52 years old. Friends and neighbors described him as steady and hardworking, a man who did his best to guide his daughter through a rocky path in life. But behind the doors of their home, father and daughter clashed often. Arguments simmered into shouting matches. Resentments piled up, unspoken and unresolved. By the time 2025 arrived, the relationship had become combustible. On a February afternoon, that combustible mix finally exploded. According to prosecutors, Christiana armed herself with a gun during yet another confrontation with her father. But this wasn't just a momentary outburst. Witnesses testified that the argument escalated, and instead of walking away, Christiana made a decision that could never be undone. She opened fire on her father, striking him fatally. But the violence didn't stop there. Another man present at the scene, a family acquaintance, was also shot and gravely injured. In that instant, Christiana's rage reached beyond her father, turning a family dispute into a broader act of destruction. The aftermath was chaos. Police rushed to the scene after frantic 911 calls. Bill Adams was pronounced dead. The second victim rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Christiana was arrested on the spot. Neighbors watched in disbelief as the young woman they had seen in their community was led away in handcuffs, accused of killing her father and nearly killing another man. In the courtroom, the case drew sharp lines between anger and accountability. Prosecutors portrayed Christiana as dangerous, driven by selfish fury rather than fear. They emphasized that her actions were deliberate, not the heat of a sudden mistake, but a choice to escalate. The defense pointed to her troubled background, hinting at emotional instability and years of strained family conflict. But the facts spoke loudly. 2 men had been shot, one fatally, and she was the one who pulled the trigger. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Christiana Ann Adams was convicted of first-degree murder for killing her father and attempted murder for wounding the second man. The sentence was heavy and final: 2 life terms in prison. For the Adams family, it was a second blow. They had lost Bill to violence and Christiana to the justice system, a father buried and a daughter locked away forever. The Adams case closes this series with the weight of the present. It shows that Parricide is not confined to history books or old tragedies. It continues today in homes across America, where anger and conflict sometimes cross the line into bloodshed. For William Adams, the hope of reconciliation with his daughter ended in gunfire. For Christiana, a lifetime now stretches behind prison walls. And for the rest of us, the case is a stark reminder that when family bonds collapse, the damage ripples outward, leaving victims, survivors, and communities struggling to understand how love can twist into something so fatal. 8 stories. 8 fathers are gone, not at the hands of strangers, but by their own daughters. From Michigan to Florida, Colorado to Nevada, these cases reveal a truth most of us don't want to face. Sometimes the danger doesn't come from outside the home. It comes from within. We've seen anger boil over in an instant, like Megan Emirowicz's chemical assault. We've watched teenagers like Crystal Howell and Sierra Halseth turn rebellion into brutality. We've uncovered the perfect murder conspiracy of the Tomaselli sisters and the double betrayal of Cheyenne Jesse, who ended not 1, but 2 lives in her own family. We've followed Dana Jennings, whose cold patience led her to bury her father in concrete, and Sherry Heffernan, who traded love for inheritance. And we've closed with Christiana Adams, whose gunfire in 2025 showed us that these tragedies are not relics of the past, but living wounds still happening today. Each case is different. The motives change: anger, greed, resentment, obsession, but the pattern is the same: a father's trust, shattered by the hand of a daughter who should have been his legacy. The result is always irreversible: a family torn apart, a community left reeling, and children of their own left to wonder how love turned to blood. As we close this series, remember the victims. They were more than headlines. They were fathers, partners, providers, men whose lives mattered. And remember, too, that behind every shocking act was a warning, signs of strain, of resentment, of untreated wounds, warnings that went unseen until it was too late. Unforeseen fates will continue to confront the darkest corners of human behavior, not for shock, but for understanding. Because only when we look unflinchingly at what happened can we ask the most important question: how can we stop it from happening again? So if you found meaning in these stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Your support helps us bring more of these carefully researched, ethically told documentaries to light. And join us next time as we uncover another story that proves sometimes the darkest betrayals are the ones we never see coming.